just want to turn it over to Sinclair at Apprenda, and I'll just briefly mention that we first, I believe, met Sinclair over a year and a half ago, and we think the overall area that he's focusing on, which is the idea of helping other ISVs deliver applications through software as a service, is a very, very compelling one. And one of the things that really got us excited about Sinclair, besides a really strong value proposition of his company, is he's a perfect blend of technical acumen and business understanding of what are the drivers why people need to move into SaaS and in the cloud. And I'll let Sinclair start on just his presentation, followed by Boomi.
As Somak mentioned, I come from a pretty interesting background. I'm a technical guy at heart. I have degrees in math and computer science, and I'll get into that in a little while. But my entire focus in life has been software as a service from an engineering point of view. So I come with a lot of war stories from the front line, building software as a service applications, knowing what's involved and getting a good feel for the effort that's required. And the talk today is going to be focused predominantly on this new concept of cloud middleware. What we do at Apprenda is that we evangelize the idea that software as a service companies or would-be software as a service companies shouldn't be doing things on their own when it comes to building complex architectures. They should be leveraging middleware, they should be leveraging cloud technologies, and we fit in that bucket as an interesting breed. We're not a service provider, we don't have hosted offerings in the cloud, but rather we're a layer, very traditional kind of middleware layer that you can license and run anywhere you want. I think the best way to set context is to think about it from the point of view of the software as a service provider. So when you think of a SaaS company, right, somebody who is delivering software in the cloud, what the typical model is you build business software, you deploy it somewhere, get it online, it doesn't matter where right now, and your customers are going to access it through a web browser. It's not going to be a situation where they're installing the bits locally and dealing with the server setup and all that stuff. But instead, they're worrying about how do I get the application in the cloud and how do I get my potentially tens of thousands of customers to access it and use that software. So what does it mean to be a SaaS vendor? This is probably fundamentally the most important definition from our perspective when you're moving to the cloud. If you're a software company, you want to become a SaaS vendor, what does that mean? First and foremost, you used to be a software company. That means you had packaged software, you sold it, and you delivered bits. It was either through a CD, through a download, or what have you. Now what you're talking about is being a service provider. Service provider, you have to take quite literally. All of our customers are now service providers. And when we say that, we mean think Comcast, think Time Warner, think anybody who offers a utility. The business model, the DNA, is very different than when you're a packaged software company, completely different. Enough that what you start needing is a variety of new tools, right? You're worrying about billing. How do you turn off service if somebody hasn't paid you at the end of the month? If you're charging for things transactionally, how do you meter and track those transactions so you can bill for it appropriately? You have a great website and you have self-provisioning and somebody wants to come in and say, hey, here's a credit card, I want access to the software. Well, how do they do that? How do you turn a customer on? All of a sudden, the switch from software company to service provider introduced all this baggage, all of these tools that you have to have in place if you're going to be effective in this space. The next thing that changed are your scale requirements. When you said your application was scalable as a packaged software company, what you really meant is that it scaled as much as your biggest customer needed. Okay? Now when you're a services company, all of your customers come to you. So it has to scale as much as all of your customer capacity requirements have, right? Your biggest customer included, plus the next 4, plus everybody else. So the scale factor of what your software needs to scale to is very different. It's no longer about the biggest customer, but rather all of the customers. And here's the key financial one, the economic model piece. Everybody who's familiar with software as a service knows that it's recurring revenue to some extent. You're charging for transactions. You're charging for time periods, maybe as in the Salesforce model, some sort of per month charge, something to that effect. What the key thing is that it's no more 100% gross margins. When you were selling packaged software, it didn't cost you anything to replicate bits. We can argue about whether the bandwidth on the download cost you anything. You're probably charging $20,000 or $30,000 for the license, so really it didn't cost you anything. You walked away with 100% of your revenue in a fashion where you can allocate it toward the operating expenses of the company. That's it. When you become a service provider, cost of goods sold is now magically introduced into your income statement. You look at it and you have revenue, and then all of this stuff got thrown out. Why? Where'd it go? It went to servers. It went to staff. It went to bandwidth. It went to all of the things required to actually produce something that people can pay you for. So the revenue line now got really small because you're not charging a whole bunch of money, and you're paying money to get money, which you've never been accustomed to, and you can throw that out. So, is it 40% of your revenue that you're spending? Is it 10%? Is it 15%? And what distinguishes somebody who's in the 40% category versus 15% category? And keeping it low is ultra critical, so that's what we're going to get into. And I think what we're going to do on the next slide is we'll zoom in to that specific question. One of the big cost components in delivering software as a service is your effectiveness of delivery. So I'm going to ask a question that has a completely obvious answer. 5,000 customers. Do you want to deliver that service to 5,000 customers across 625 servers or 90? Right? 90 servers sounds a lot better. We're talking about a big difference there. Well, what's the difference? How do you get scenarios where sometimes it's 90 servers to satisfy 5,000 customers versus 625? What I want to do is choose 2 real-world examples that embody 2 different scenarios that put things at the opposite end of the spectrums here. The next slide is a prospect we had come to us earlier in the year. They're a software company, arguably their software as a service. They've been hosting software for a while. I don't want to get into the debate as to whether that's SaaS or not right now. But what they came to us with was this interesting profile. 150 customers, 2,000 end users across 50 servers. They had a 3-to-1 customer density, 3 customers per server. That's a pretty critical number when you think about that density, because that's what's going to dictate how many servers you're going to need as you grow. And that's going to dictate how much you're going to spend in collecting that revenue. You know, that this is the 40% versus 15% marker. Terrible COGS profile. They spent so much money on this infrastructure, even only at 50 servers, to offer it, between IT staff, between the fact the footprint was pretty big relative to that, and they had complete lack of operational agility. So they got worried and they said, geez, what happens when we move to 300 customers? What about 600? What about 1,200, 2,000? These numbers, these ratios start to break down at that level. So they're at one end of the spectrum where we have red here for a good reason, not a healthy situation. The next one is actually Peter's company, Salesforce.com. I think, Peter, you might have blogged about this in March of last year, right around there, where they released some numbers, I think during some sort of event, where they had 55,000 customers, 1.5 million end users across 1,000 servers. And even more interesting in this scenario is that supposedly out of those 1,000 servers, half were mirrors, meaning half were doing operational work. And we look at that, that's really 55-to-1 density with this number, 110-to-1 density with that number. So great COGS profile, top-notch operational agility. How do we get such drastically, starkly different scenarios, right? 3-to-1 versus 110-to-1. What was the factor here? If anybody asks that question, then all of a sudden you start thinking about the real problems with respect to moving to software as a service. The fundamental difference is that Salesforce was purpose-built for SaaS delivery, right? The folks that we were talking to were not. They were built in a traditional on-premises model, and they were replicating. They would go through and say, here's the application. It has nothing to do with SaaS, but I'm going to host it in the cloud on EC2, or maybe I'm doing my own data center, and I'm just going to fire up servers. Now what we end up with is, again, red and green, good and bad. True SaaS architectures True SaaS architectures introduce this concept of single instance multi-tenancy. Salesforce was one of the pioneers in this category, where you can take fundamentally those low-level app components, think your database, think your web services, think your UIs, and share them logically within the component. Don't replicate each one of those for each customer, but rather create some sort of sharing mechanism that allows the application to influence the segregation and isolation and get lots and lots and lots of customers on single instances of the applications or application components themselves. Huge density boost there. Also, since the application isn't SaaS naive, it's purpose-built for SaaS, you can also hook a lot of that SaaS tooling at a much lower level. When an application is sitting as a non-SaaS application in a cloud environment or on a server, you could bolt tools around the outside of the application. They're not deep within the application, monitoring things like transactions and knowing how to charge for them, keeping track of fine-grained tuning around provisioning, what can be turned on and off. Those things are just totally void in a non-SaaS architecture. The downside of this, and this is something you could ask Peter about later, is that it's extremely complicated. It requires a bench of deep expertise, very hard to do correctly. Salesforce.com is a venture-backed company, right? Or they were prior to going public and all that fun jazz. Spent a lot of money on R&D, and that continues to go on over time. I'm sure they have lots of developers that are always thinking about these hard architecture problems of how do we get this low-level resource sharing, how do we get the tooling integrated with the application software itself and really turn that into a powerful business. On that side, the throw hardware at it scenario is we're going to solve it at the infrastructure layer. We're going to replicate everything. We don't get any of those benefits. We get the terrible cost of delivery profile and nothing good. And I shouldn't say that, actually. I mean, there's some scenarios where that's okay. You know, you have really big contracts, small customer base, and they want it hosted. You probably don't need this. But those are few and far in between in the software space. It's a cheap way out up front, but you pay dearly over the long term. This sort of non-SaaS SaaS architecture isn't going to cut it. So the next thing I hear when I talk to somebody and they start to understand the difference here is, we'll just throw it on the cloud and it's solved. And this is some of the stuff that Peter talked about earlier. Depending on what you're looking at, if you're looking at Amazon EC2, by virtue of bundling your application and getting it on the cloud, it's not any better economically at this point. You're still replicating it. You just have a trusted partner in the cloud that can instantaneously on tap replicate that for you and fire up the resources whenever you need and tear them down whenever you need. God forbid a customer leaves, well, you shut off a VM on EC2. You don't have to figure out how to sell a salvaged box that's been sitting in your data center that's no longer being used. So totally wrong. So the next question becomes, how can I get that sort of profile, a Salesforce.com style profile where I have ultimate efficiency a true SaaS architecture where the application has that sharing at a really low level? How can I get all the necessary tools around the application and in the application to manage my provisioning, to manage my metering, to manage my billing, all fundamental questions. And then in many cases, how do I leverage the skills I have? We have customers, and I'll get into the details of more what we do, that are startups who have .NET developers and they don't know anything else, to software companies that have millions of lines of .NET code that they don't want to throw out, and it would be unwise for them to throw out. So how can I leverage this and get all of this without making a 7 or 8 figure investment in R&D or keeping a line item in my R&D budget that will constantly be there to manage my own SaaS stack and build out my own SaaS stack? Jeopardize my window of opportunity because I decide that I'm going to build all this out and tack on 9 to 10 months on my development cycle to build a shoddy SaaS system that really isn't going to cut it anyway. And furthermore, how am I going to deal with the fact, get all of this and not deal with the fact that I don't want to lose my focus on my competencies? If I'm in the healthcare software business, I write great healthcare software. I understand HIPAA. I know what my customers want. I shouldn't have to take on the burdens of figuring out how to become a SaaS stack developer. Just like most software companies don't decide, you know what, great idea. We're going to build healthcare software and we're going to invent our own new DB. Typically a bad idea, right? You go out and you buy Oracle, you buy SQL Server, you download MySQL, then you focus on the stuff you know well, healthcare management software. SaaS is the same, it's a stack component. So what we do at Apprenda is we've developed a server technology named SaaSgrid. And the best way to describe SaaSgrid is an application server, both physically and conceptually. What that means is that we'll take a whole bunch of Windows servers, stitch them together into one big network. So it could be 10 servers, it could be 100, it could be 500. And that network creates a logical hosting layer for other applications to be deployed on top of. And what you end up with is a fine-tuned, specialized server technology that gives you all of those things in an inheritable fashion. So what SaaSgrid does is it lets you build your application using pretty traditional technologies. Think .NET. You're going to deploy that with a pretty traditional database, web services, UIs, and we fundamentally change the behavior of the applications. We transform the applications so that unbeknownst to the app itself, it's doing things like mixing data for potentially thousands of customers in one database instance, not a database per customer. The app code is issuing its queries, it's doing its thing, and it doesn't know that this is happening. So it's inherited this robust enterprise class SaaS architecture, doesn't have to go down the replication route of every time I sign up a new customer, I'm going to replicate the whole application stack. But they didn't have to go through the effort that Salesforce went through in terms of building this really complex beast of an architecture that gives you all that value. Without SaaSgrid, those applications still have to do that on their own. We have customers that went down this path right now and said, hey, we're going to build this awesome SaaS offering with .NET. They get to about the first box, and then they call. Okay? And when they call, they say, we tried it, we don't like it, can you help? Okay? They come and they say, can we license this, and we're going to build our app. So as a company, we were founded in 2006, and I mentioned that I have some war stories, and I think it's kind of important to know this because this is a eat our own dog food type scenario. My co-founders and I worked on a variety of software as a service projects together, and it spanned the range where it was software as a service, meaning replicate the stack, and we were really writing code that managed VM environments, to writing true single instance multi-tenancy type situations when you look at it from the spectrum. And we visited all of these and really understand fundamentally how they were built. We started Apprenda originally to build help desk software. I come from that domain. I really know the domain really well. And we said, we're going to build a SaaS help desk offering. About a month in, we said, geez, we don't want to do all of this ourselves. Start calling people and figure out that there's no good enablement technology that fundamentally solves these problems in a generic, unobtrusive fashion so you can use traditional industry-hardened stacks but get all the benefit of that type of robust architecture. So the founding team is very much a patients turned doctors. And the whole goal was, can we become the engine for the cloud? We have cloud providers that have all this wonderful, great infrastructure, solves a ton of infrastructure problems, but who's going to fundamentally solve those deep architecture problems and tooling problems that need to be solved if the space is really going to move forward? So that's a refocus. And to date, we've raised a little over $6 million in venture capital. We closed a $5 million round this past November with NEA and High Peaks Ventures. And we've been focusing on this ever since. To date, our customer log roll consists of people from all kinds of verticals. We have folks in learning management software, healthcare software, CRM, so it's purely and obviously a horizontal problem. And a technology like this has a horizontal solution capability, so it's coming in and solving this around all these different verticals. Now, we focus typically on software companies that are in the $5 million to $200 million revenue range. And as Peter mentioned, there's the old code in the new cloud scenario. It's more old skill or old stack in the new cloud. When we look at this, we have people who are writing brand new, they're part of existing software companies that are $100 million a year. They're saying brand new product line, or service line in this case, right? We want to be a service player. We're going to make this new thing over here. We have a development staff of 22 people that know SQL Server, that know .NET. How can we get there and not throw them out and figure out this whole scenario? So we come in and plug that gap. We have customers in our portfolio that are pure startups that simply said, two guys in a garage, we know SaaS, we want to go out and build a SaaS offer, or sorry, we know .NET, we want to go out and build a SaaS offering. How can we do it? We license SaaSgrid. Again, we're not a utility, we're not a hosting company or anything like that. What people do is that they license SaaSgrid based on the number of servers in that big server mesh we talked about. So if they're really successful and they have 80, 90, 200 servers in their grid, they pay us for that. If they have 5, they pay us for that. So they can stretch that out and they can deploy it wherever they want. We have folks that are doing their own data centers here in the Northeast. We have folks that are using Amazon's EC2 to deploy SaaSgrid on top of EC2 and get the benefit of a cloud infrastructure. So there's no sort of bias as to where this gets deployed so long as it's pretty native traditional Windows server. And our customers, what we found to date, and some of the case studies we've been producing that will be released soon highlight this, is that there are savings across the board, both upfront and kind of long-term here. Typically speaking, you'll see anywhere between 40 or 60%, so I took the 50% mark here, reduction in upfront capital investment. So when they're saying we're going to become a SaaS player and this is what we need to invest to get there, take half of that and throw it out the window. You know, they're not paying that anymore. When we're looking at the time to market pieces, those are pretty critical. They're saying, okay, we have this window of opportunity. We need to move now because our competitors are moving very quickly. We need to respond to the market. We shave another 50% off of that equation. And then ongoing, just like the database scenario, they don't go off and build a team to manage their own custom database that they built from scratch. They pay somebody like Oracle or Microsoft money, or they download MySQL and get the expertise of an evolving component of their stack that they don't pay for as an R&D budget line item, right? They're not looking at this and saying, we have 8 or 9 developers on staff. They're going to keep up with the market and evolve the SaaS stack over time. That's not part of the equation anymore. So there's no more competency creep, no notion of them having to understand SaaS, at least fundamentally at the lowest levels. Instead, they focus on their business. And a little bit of kind of selfless branding and pleasure here, but when we look at this, we had a CEO from one of our customers who's a market leader in their vertical. We'll be releasing a case study about who they are next month. And when I say market leader, like top in their category in Europe. And what they looked at is they said, we're a .NET shop, we need to move to the cloud. And once they went through vendor selection, trying to figure out what's best for them, they said without SaaSgrid, this would have been not possible, without spending a huge amount of time and money. They said, we have this money, we don't want to spend it, we'd rather put that in sales and marketing and get people to buy our stuff. The only feasible way to do it is to use SaaSgrid, and they move forward with us, and they built their entire SaaS strategy and technology model on top of this. So it's good to see this. You know, it feels good personally because I know I've solved somebody's problem that I've been through before, and I don't want to see other people go through it. But then to see it validated in the market this way is huge. For somebody to look at this and say our entire business strategy, our technical strategy, is banked on this type of technology, you know we're doing something pretty special at that point. And our future. Right now, we want to continue the success story in the ISV market. There are so many software companies out there that are making the transition. And don't quote me on this, but I think the most recent number I saw was that 7% of software companies have either transitioned or will be this year. That means 93% aren't, right? So a huge, huge chunk of the software business, and I'm not doom and gloom where all 93% are going to go out of business because of the 7%. That's not going to happen. Some chunk will, clearly, maybe 10, 15, 20%, what have you. But those 93% have to say to themselves, all right, when are we making the move and how? And that's what I see often. I haven't met a CEO or CTO that hasn't said we're not moving to SaaS. They all say we are. It's a question of when. So this market is very critical to us. We want to catalyze that. We want to take people out of that 93% bucket, move them to the 7% bucket because now it's feasible due to our technology. Next is, looking at the enterprise. It's another interesting discussion. I think anybody in the cloud talks about the enterprise. Fundamentally, what I found is nobody really understands why they should be talking about the enterprise. I worked at Morgan Stanley for a little while, and one thing I could tell you is that we would write an application for one business unit, and a little while later, about 70 business units wanted that application because it was horizontally applicable. And you know what they did? They stood up a VM or a box for each business unit. Sound familiar? It's the same way that people build SaaS models when they're not thinking about true SaaS architectures. So the idea that you can solve with this same type of SaaS-tuned architecture the delivery problems within the enterprise is very intriguing, and I think it's where we'll see both the space evolve and Apprenda evolve. And last is keep a watch on this model. There was never a point in time where somebody looked at this and, well, there were some people that said the desktop is the be-all, end-all delivery model. Clearly wasn't. SaaS, I don't think will be. Cloud will continue to evolve. 10 years from now, I'd be shocked if it's identical to what we see right now. And to stay in tune with this and change it at a level where the customers vicariously get that change is huge. We want to keep current because then our customers keep current. So the more we can do that, the better off we are. I think that covers it. I don't know if there's time for questions, but
sure.
Yeah?
Sure.
Any questions from anybody in the crowd? Yes?
Why did you decide to lead with Windows and .NET and then you do a similar offering in the Unix space?
Yep. So I come from a Unix, actually OpenBSD and Java background, right? So now I'm in the .NET space. There was one logical approach here. What we started looking at is trending. We started finding out that a lot of the .NET developers and the more .NET shops were looking at the cloud a little more seriously when it came to building software as a service businesses. So we saw that there was probably a better adoption curve there going on. Second, it's very homogenous. You know, when you're looking at Java, and this is me coming from the Java background again, it's splintered. Yeah, it's not write once, run anywhere. It doesn't work. I've written stuff specifically for JBoss, then it didn't work on WebSphere, then I read it for WebSphere and it wouldn't work over here. That doesn't really happen in .NET. So the easiest way to look at this is there's a lot of homogeneity and the opportunities seem more fresh for us. And the answer is, you know, I think we always look at these other stacks, the old stacks, as sub-stacks. I think Peter's right in that the stack is evolving up, right? And we're higher up on the stack abstraction at this point. So we'd like to look at things in the future and say, hey, maybe it's time to support Java, maybe it's time to support PHP. That's never out of the question. Any other questions?
I'll have a chance to catch up with them afterwards. So
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.